Everybody in that valley had a price. $1 a day for a ranch hand, 2 bits for a hot meal at the boarding house. A man's whole life sometimes for less than that. But I never once in 51 years above ground had a soul look me dead in the eye and offer me a full day's labor, sun up to the last light, for one plate of food. Not money, not a wage, not a promise of tomorrow. One plate. And when I tell you who was standing at my gate saying it, hollow-cheeked, dust to the knees, holding herself straight as a fence post out of pure stubborn dignity, you'll understand why I forgot how to speak. I'm going to tell you the whole thing, the way it happened, not the way I wish it had. The dog didn't bark. That's the first thing I want you to understand, because in my experience that dog barked at wind, at his own shadow, at the very idea of a stranger. Old Cuff would set to hollering if a jackrabbit so much as thought about crossing the yard. So when I came out of the barn wiping tallow off my hands and saw a person standing at my front gate, and Cuff just sitting there beside her with his ears up soft, not growling, not wagging, just watching her the way you watch something you can't quite figure, I stopped where I stood. I've kept a tally book my whole life. Cattle, dollars, sacks of feed, days without rain. When my hands don't know what to do, they reach for that little book and a pencil stub and I count. My wife used to say I'd count the stars if the Lord ever held still long enough. So I'll be honest with you, the first thing I did, standing there in my own yard with a stranger at my gate, was start counting. Fence rails, 7 between us. I counted them twice. She let me finish. That's a thing I noticed even then, some part of me filing it away while the rest of me gawked. She didn't rush to speak, didn't fill up the quiet with begging the way a lot of folks did that year. It was a hard year. The worst of the drought had cracked the whole territory open like an old plate, and there wasn't a road in the county that didn't have somebody walking it looking for something that wasn't there anymore. Work, water, a dead relation, a live one. I'd turned away more people than I care to remember, and I'd fed a few, and I'd lain awake over both. But this one didn't beg. She was Apache. I knew it before she opened her mouth, knew it from the way she wore what she wore, from the moccasins gone gray with alkali dust, from a stillness in her that white folks in those parts had learned to fear, and I had learned over enough years to just plain respect. Her dress had been mended so many times it was more thread than cloth in places, and someone had done the mending with care, small even stitches, the kind you only bother with when you love a thing or you've got nothing else to do with your hands in the long dark. She stood maybe 5 feet and a couple inches, and she'd have weighed nothing at all soaking wet. There were shadows under her cheekbones that weren't put there by the sun. I put her at somewhere past 30 and shy of 50, and I couldn't have told you closer than that, because hunger and hard traveling steal a person's age right off their face and hide it somewhere you can't see. Help you? I said, which was a fool thing to say. It's what you say to a man who wanders into your store, not to a woman standing at your gate at the tail end of a day that had already worn me down to the nub. She looked at me a moment longer. Then she said in English clear enough to cut, "I will work for you, one day, all of it." She lifted one hand, palm up, not begging, offering. "For food, one plate, that is all I ask." I want to tell you I answered her straight off. I didn't. I stood there like a stump. See, I'd heard 100 versions of give me something. Give me a coin. Give me water for my horse. Give me a heel of bread and I'll be gone before you finish blinking. I had a whole set of practiced answers for all of those, ready to go, worn smooth as river stones from use. Some kind, some not. It had been a bad year and a man learns to armor himself, or he gives away his whole ranch a biscuit at a time and starves along with everybody else. But nobody had ever offered first. Nobody had ever put the labor on the table before the food. She wasn't asking me to be generous. She was asking me to make a trade, and she was setting the terms high in her own favor of giving a whole day, every hour of it, against a single plate. Any man with a lick of business sense knew that was a bad deal for her and a fine one for me. Which is exactly why I couldn't take it. That's not, I started and stopped, cleared my throat, counted the rails again without meaning to. Ma'am, a day's work is worth more than a plate of food. That ain't a fair trade. Something moved behind her eyes, not a smile, close to one but harder. Fair, she said like she was turning the word over to see what was under it. I do not need fair. I need to eat, and I do not want to steal, and I do not want your, she paused, hunting the English for it, your pity. Pity you will give once and feel good, and then you will want me to go. Work you will remember. Next time you need hands you will remember I worked. That is not fair. That is better than fair. And there it was. That's when the thing happened that the fellow who titled my whole story right, I was left speechless. Because she was right, and she'd thought it clean through, and she'd walked I don't know how many miles of cracked ground to arrive at a stranger's gate with her whole argument already built and standing. She wasn't a beggar who'd stumbled onto my land. She was a woman who had sat down somewhere in the dark and reasoned her way to the one offer a hard, tired man could not honorably refuse. And then she had carried that offer across the desert on legs that could barely hold her up. I've been quiet plenty of times in my life. I'm not a talker by nature. My late wife handled most of the talking for the both of us, and I've been running short on words ever since she passed. But that was a different kind of quiet. That was the quiet of a man who has just been outthought by somebody the whole world had agreed to look down on, and knows it, and is ashamed of the world and himself and the year and the whole dried-up country all at once. I opened the gate. I set her to the hay, because it was the easy work, or I thought it was. There was a load I'd been meaning to move into the loft for a week and hadn't, on account of my knee and my age, and the general sense that the whole enterprise of ranching had gotten too big for one grieving old man to keep pushing uphill. I figured she'd do what she could, and I'd feed her regardless of how much got done, and we'd both keep our dignity and I'd send her on her way. I figured wrong. I've watched grown men, big men, young men, men I paid good money move hay slower than that woman moved it. She found the pitchfork like it was an old friend. She found the rhythm of the loft rope in about 4 pulls. She didn't stop. That's the thing I keep coming back to all these years later. She did not stop. Not to complain, not to stretch her back, not to angle for a rest or a compliment or a second look. She'd found the work and the work had found her, and the two of them went at it while the sun came around. I made a show of doing my own chores. Truth is I kept drifting to where I could see her. There's a way a body moves when it's running on empty. I've seen it in cattle at the end of a dry drive, that jerky, careful economy, like every motion's being paid for out of a purse that's nearly flat. She moved like that. Every so often she'd stop with one hand flat against the barn post and just breathe, eyes shut, gathering herself, and I'd start toward her thinking that's it, she's done, I'll feed her now. And she'd pick the fork back up. Around midday I couldn't stand it. I brought a dipper of water out to her without a word and she looked at it and looked at me and I saw her do the arithmetic, is this part of the plate? Does drinking this put me in his debt further? And I said, gruff as I could manage, water ain't food. Water's just water. Drink it, and she drank it. 3 long swallows, handed the dipper back. Said thank you in a voice that had gone to sandpaper, picked the fork back up. I went and sat on the porch step and I opened my tally book and I did not write one single thing in it. I just held it, because I did not know what I was witnessing, and my hands wanted something to hold while I figured it out. By late afternoon, the whole load was in the loft, stacked neat, neater than I'd have done it. And she'd found the broken hinge on the tack room door without me saying a word and set it half to rights with a rock and a bent nail. And she'd stacked the split wood that had been laying every which way by the block. She wasn't doing the one job I'd given her. She was doing the ranch, the way a person does when they've run a place of their own and can't help seeing what needs doing. That's when I understood she'd had a home once, a real one, and that whatever had happened to it, it was bad enough to put her at my gate offering her whole self for one plate of food. I have got to tell you about the meal, because the meal is the part that stayed with me. The sun was going down red through the dust the way it did all that awful summer, and I told her, ordered her, near enough to sit on the porch and be still. She'd earned it 3 times over, and if she moved another sack of anything, I was going to have words. She sat. She sat the way exhausted people sit, all at once, like the strings got cut. I'm no cook. My wife was the cook, and after she went I mostly lived on beans and biscuit and whatever I could shoot. But that evening I did something I hadn't done since the funeral. I made a real supper. I traded a neighbor for a little salt pork earlier that month, and I'd been saving it, and I fried it up, and I made biscuits from scratch and got them near enough to how Ellen used to. And I opened the last jar of the peaches Ellen had put up before she got sick, the last of her peaches, the very last, and I want you to know I did not decide to open that jar with my head. My head would have said save them. My hands opened it while my head was elsewhere. I have thought about that 100 times. I made 2 plates. I set them both on the porch table, and I sat down across from her, and I saw her stare at the food like it might vanish, and then I saw her look at the second plate, mine, and I watched her understand that I meant to eat with her, sit at the same table, and something crossed her face then that I'd not seen the whole day, not through all that killing work, not through the pride and the arithmetic and the sandpaper thank yous. Her chin trembled, just once. She got it back under control fast. You don't have to do that, she said, quiet. The second plate, the peaches, that is more than a plate. I know what it is, I said. Then why? And I didn't have an answer for her that would fit in words, so I gave her the only true one I had, which was, because my wife would have. And I picked up my fork so she'd pick up hers, so we could stop looking at each other, because I was about half a second from disgracing myself in front of a stranger, and I expect she was too. She ate slow, I noticed that. A starving person, you'd think, would fall on it. She ate slow and careful, and she made every bite last, and I realized after a while she wasn't savoring it, she was rationing it, some deep animal part of her not yet convinced there'd be more, wanting the feeling of full to stretch as far as it could go. About halfway through she stopped, set her fork down, looked at the food that was left. And I saw her wrap it, right there. She had a cloth from somewhere in her mended dress, and she reached for a biscuit and half the pork like she was going to save it, hide it, carry it. Eat it, I said. There's more where that came from. Which was a lie, mostly. There wasn't much more. But I'd have gone hungry a week to unsay the look on her face when she started to hide that food away like a stray dog. She didn't eat it. She wrapped it careful and set the bundle in her lap and put both hands over it. And she looked at me across Ellen's last peaches with the red light dying behind her, and she said, "There is someone else." 2 of Cuff's tail thumps against the porch board. I counted them. I count when I don't know what's coming. "There is a child," she said. "In the rocks above the wash. I told him stay. Do not come out no matter what, not for anyone." Her hands pressed flat on that little bundle of biscuit and pork. "I could not bring him to a stranger's gate. If you had said no to me, 1 is bad. 2, you would have set the dogs on, so I came alone. And I worked. And I would have carried this to him tonight and told him I found food, and he would not have known I gave a whole day for it." I sat there. She misread my silence. I saw her start to gather herself, start to stand, start to armor back up for the rejection she'd been braced for since the moment she walked up. "I will go now," she said. "I did not ask for 2 plates. I did not lie to you. The work was for me. The child is mine." "Sit down," I said. She stopped. "Sit down," I said again, softer, and I was already up out of my chair, already moving toward the door and the kitchen and whatever was left in it, already doing the math on how much food a growing child needs and how little I had, and how little that mattered against the size of the thing that had just walked into my life. How old? And what? The child in the rocks, how old is he? She looked at me for a long, long moment. Then something in her let go, not all the way. She was too smart and too hurt to let go all the way, but a little. Enough. 7, she said. He is 7, and he is very brave, and he is very quiet, and he has not eaten a full meal in, her voice went. She pressed her lips together, got it back. In some time, she finished. I stood in my own doorway with the dark coming on, and a whole day's honest work stacked neat in my barn, and the last of my dead wife's peaches sitting sweet on the porch table between me and a woman braver than any soldier I ever knew, and I made the first of the decisions that were going to cost me. I didn't know yet how much. You never do, at the front end of a thing like that. Then we better go get him, I said, before it's full dark and he's out there alone and scared and thinking the worst. Grab a lantern off that hook, and bring the food. Bring all of it. She stood up. Tell me which and say, next part, whenever you're ready. Rotation locked in for this story. Trait equals endurance persistence plus dignity. Narrator quirk equals the tally book / counting when unsure. Scenario equals survival plus hidden child plus a coming moral cost. Ending style reserved for part 3 equals bittersweet. Cut short for ambiguity. Part 2 architected emotionally resonant narrative expansion with interconnected character. Threads architected emotionally resonant narrative expansion with interconnected character threads part 2. The wash was farther than she'd let on. I noticed that too, the way she'd shaved the distance down when she first spoke of it, said above the wash like it was a stone's throw off my north fence, when in truth it was better than 2 miles of broken country in the dark. She'd done that on purpose, I understood later. If the distance sounded small, the favor sounded small, and a small favor is easier for a tired man to grant than a large one. She was still working me even then, still setting the terms careful in my favor, still trying to make herself cost as little as a human being possibly can. I want you to sit with that a second, because I've turned it over 1,000 nights since. Here was a woman who had already given me a whole day of the hardest labor I ever watched a person do, walking me out into the dark to save her own child, and she was still trying to make it easy on me, still trying to be no trouble, as if trouble were a thing she had no right to be. I carried the lantern. She wouldn't take it, said her eyes were better in the dark than mine, which was true, and also she wanted her hands free, which I didn't understand until later and wish I'd never understood at all. Cuff went ahead of us the whole way, nose down, tail low, that fool dog who I'd have sworn couldn't track a steak through a butcher shop, and he went straight as a plumb line toward those rocks like something was pulling him. Animals know. I've quit pretending they don't. They know things we've trained ourselves stupid about. I counted my steps for a while. It's a thing I do. I got to somewhere past 400 and lost the thread when she started to talk. She didn't mean to, I think. It came out of her sideways, the way the true things do, when the dark gives you cover and your legs are moving and you don't have to look at the person you're telling it to. His name is Tadchi, she said, then quieter. In your tongue, a man once called him Samuel, a missionary. I let him because the man gave us flour. A sound came out of her that wasn't quite a laugh. Flour for a name. It seemed a small thing to trade. Now I think maybe not so small. Now the boy answers to both, and I do not know any more which one is his. Where's his father? I asked. I shouldn't have. I knew it was wrong the second it left my mouth, the way you know you've stepped on a rotten board a half instant too late to take it back. She didn't answer for maybe 50 steps. I counted them. There was sickness, she said finally. And before the sickness there were the soldiers, and before the soldiers there was a place we lived that we do not live in anymore. She said it flat. Not cold, flat, the way a stone is flat. Worn down by so much water passing over it that it's given up having edges. I am not going to tell it to you, not because I do not trust you, because I have told it to myself so many times that the telling has worn a groove in me, and if I walk that groove tonight I will not be able to climb back out, and I need to climb the rocks and get my son. Do you understand? Yes, I said, and I did. I understood it better than she knew. There's a version of Ellen's dying that I've told myself so many times it's cut a channel right through the middle of me, and there are nights I won't let myself near the edge of it because I know I'd go over. We walked the rest of the way without words. Just Cuff's paws on the gravel, and the lantern hiss, and the wind coming down the wash the way it does when the land gives back the day's heat all at once, and somewhere off in the dark, a nighthawk making that sound they make, like something tearing very softly. She stopped us a good ways out from the rocks and made a call. Low, 3 notes like a bird, but not any bird I knew. She waited, made it again. And out of the black jumble of stone, so small I'd have walked past him in daylight, a shape unfolded. I have seen brave men in my life. I rode with some in my younger years before the ranch, when the territory was rougher than it is now, and a man sometimes had to be hard to stay above ground. I have seen fellows stand their ground against things that would turn your hair, but I don't know that I ever saw courage quite like that boy's, and I want to try to tell you why, because it wasn't the loud kind. He came out slow. He had a look on his face I've only ever otherwise seen on grown soldiers, that flat, ready watchfulness that I have learned not to hope too fast look, on a face that should have been worried about nothing worse than chores and bedtime. He'd stayed. That was the thing. His mother had told him stay, no matter what, not for anyone, and he had stayed in a pile of rocks in the dark for I don't know how many hours, alone, hungry, 7 years old, with the whole enormous night pressing down on him. And he had not come out, not for the wind, not for the nighthawk, not for his own fear, until she made the sound that meant it was her and it was safe. That's not a child's obedience. That's a child who has already learned, too young, that the rules his mother gives him are the thin wall between him and a world that has hurt them both. He obeyed her the way you hold your breath underwater, because coming up too soon can kill you. He ran the last few steps and she went down on her knees in the gravel and caught him, and neither of them made a sound. That's what got me. No crying, no words, just the two of them locked together in the lantern light, her hand cupped around the back of his head, his face pressed into her mended shoulder, both of them silent as stone, because they had learned, somewhere back down that road she wouldn't walk me down, that noise in the dark is a thing that gets you found. I looked away. A man ought to at a moment like that. I looked up at the rocks and I counted stars until my eyes quit stinging. Then the boy saw me. He went stiff in his mother's arms. His hand, I saw it, closed around a rock, a good sharp one, sized for a 7-year-old's palm and no less deadly for that, and he put himself half in front of her, this scrap of a thing ready to throw stones at a grown man twice his size to buy his mother a running start. She felt him move and understood it and said something low in their tongue, quick and gentle, and I caught my own name in it. She'd learned my name at some point in the day, and I hadn't even noticed telling it to her, and the boy's grip on the rock didn't loosen. Not all the way, just enough. I brought food, she told him in English now, I think for my benefit so I'd know what she was saying to him. This man gave a whole day of work for it, and then he gave more than we asked. He is, she stopped. I watched her hunt for the word, and I watched her decide not to promise the boy something she couldn't be sure of. He is not going to hurt us tonight, is what she settled on. Not he is good, not he is our friend, just not tonight. That was as far as she'd let herself go, and I couldn't fault her the caution. She'd earned every inch of it. I crouched down, slow, so my old knee wouldn't betray me and so I wouldn't loom. I set the lantern on a flat rock between us, and I opened the bundle she'd wrapped at supper, the biscuit, the pork, and I laid it out on the cloth in the light where the boy could see it, and I pushed it toward him, and I did the only thing I could think to do that might mean something to a child who'd learned to fear the whole grown world. I took the smaller biscuit, and I ate it myself, first, in front of him. Because a poisoner doesn't eat the bait. Any starving creature knows that. And I saw him watch me chew and swallow, watched him do the small, ancient arithmetic of survival, and then, only then did he let go of the rock and reach for the food. He ate the way she had at first, rationing, making it last. 7 years old and already carrying that in him, the deep certainty that full is a lie that never keeps its promise. Slow, his mother murmured, a hand on his back. Slow, or it will come back up. There is time. There is time. She said it to comfort him. But I heard the thing underneath it, the thing she maybe didn't hear herself, which was that for a long time there had not been time, that There is time was a brand new luxury she was trying out in her mouth to see if it would hold weight. Here's where I have to slow down and tell you the hard part, because if I skip it, the rest of what happened won't make sense. And I promised at the start of all this that I'd tell it the way it happened and not the way I wish. I brought them back to the ranch. I want to be clear that this was not a small thing, and I want to be clear that I knew it wasn't, standing out there in the wash with a fed child and his mother and my fool dog. Bringing them to the barn for a night, feeding them at my gate that a man could do quiet, and no one need know, and there'd be no consequence past his own conscience and a lighter larder. But bringing an Apache woman and her Apache son under my roof, in that year, in that valley, that was the kind of thing that got talked about. That got remembered. That got a man's name said a certain way at the feed store, and his fences cut some dark night by fellows who felt they were doing the Lord's work by it. I knew all that. I did it anyway. I'd like to tell you it was because I'm a good man, but the truth is smaller and stranger than that. The truth is I'd made 2 plates at supper without deciding to, and opened Ellen's last peaches without deciding to, and once your hands have already told you what kind of man you are, it gets awful hard for your head to argue. I put them in the barn the first night. Not because I thought less of them, because the barn was warmer than the house, truth be told, and because I understood without being told that a woman like her would sleep easier with a door she could get out of fast than one that only opened one way. I brought them blankets. Ellen's good blankets, the wool ones, and I saw the woman note whose they'd have been and not say anything, and I was grateful to her for not saying anything. The boy fell asleep before I'd got the second blanket spread. Just went out, mid-motion, the way children do when the fear finally lets go of them and their body seizes the chance. She sat beside him with her back to the wall where she could see the door, and she looked at me across the lantern light and she said, "Why?" Same question as at supper. She kept asking it. I've come to think she asked it because she needed to find the catch. In her experience there was always a catch, and a kindness with no catch was more frightening to her than plain cruelty, because plain cruelty at least you understood the shape of. A kindness you couldn't explain, that could turn on you. That could have teeth you hadn't seen yet. So I gave her the truest answer I had, which wasn't much of one. "I don't rightly know," I said. "I lost my wife 2 years back, and before that I lost well. A man loses things, and after a while the losing is most of what he's got left, and it gets so a day goes by, and the only tally in my book is what I lost that day and what I've got left to lose. And then you walked up to my gate and offered me a whole day of your life for 1 plate of food, and it was the first thing in 2 years that made me want to add something to the book instead of subtract." I looked at my hands. "That's not a good reason. That's a selfish one if you turn it right. I'm doing this part ways for me. You ought to know that, so it's a fair trade and not a debt." She was quiet a long while. "That," she said finally, "is the first true thing you have said to me. The peaches, the second plate, those were kind, but this is true, and I trust true more than I trust kind." She pulled the wool blanket up over her sleeping son. "Kind people leave when kindness gets expensive. True people sometimes stay." I didn't have anything to say to that. I got up, and my knee cracked like a rifle in the quiet, and she almost smiled. And I went to the house and lay in my bed and did not sleep. And out in the barn, a woman sat up against a wall with her eyes on the door and did not sleep either. And I expect the 2 of us watched the same square of window go from black to gray, and neither of us knew the other was doing it. The trouble started on the 4th day, and it started, the way trouble does, wearing a friendly face. Harlan Price ran the biggest spread in the valley, and he ran a good deal else besides. He had money in the bank at the county seat, and money in the pockets of 2 or 3 men who wore badges, and he'd had his eye on my little ranch for years, on account of I sat on the only reliable spring for 6 miles in any direction. In a drought year, a reliable spring is worth more than gold, and Harlan Price knew it, and I knew he knew it, and we'd been circling that fact politely for the better part of a decade. He rode up on the 4th day with 2 of his hands and his hat in his hand, and a smile on his face like a man selling something. By then the woman, I ought to tell you her name. She'd given it to me on the second day, quiet, like handing over something breakable. It was Nashoba's people's word that meant something close to she who stands in the wind, and I could not say it right no matter how she coached me. And eventually she took pity on me, and said I could call her by the missionary name they'd hung on her, which was Sarah. And I hated that I had to, and she saw that I hated it, and that was maybe the moment she started, a little, to trust me. By the fourth day, Sarah had already patched half the things on my place that had been broke for a year. And her boy had gone from throwing rocks wary to shadowing me around the yard at a careful 10-foot distance, watching everything I did with those flat, watchful eyes. And once, just once, I'd made him laugh. I'd tripped over a bucket and gone down cussing, and he'd laughed, this startled bark of a laugh like it surprised him as much as me, and then clapped both hands over his mouth like he'd done something dangerous, which, where he came from, laughing out loud maybe was. Harlan Price saw them before he was halfway up my drive. I watched his smile change. It didn't drop. Men like Price don't let their smiles drop. That's how you know to fear them. But it changed. Went from selling something to filing something away, and I felt my stomach go to lead. "Didn't know you'd taken on help," he called out, easy as anything, reining up. His two hands sat their horses behind him and looked at Sarah the way men look at a thing they've been taught not to see as a person. And I saw Sarah go very still, and I saw her ease herself between those men's eyeline and the barn where her boy was, without seeming to move at all, the way she did everything. "Didn't know I answered to you for my hearing," I said. Price laughed like I'd made a joke. "Course not, course not." He looked at Sarah again, longer this time. "Just a fella hears things. And there's fellas in this valley, I'm not one of 'em, you understand. I'm a live and let live man myself, but there's fellas who take an unfriendly interest. Be a shame. Man out here alone one spring, no near neighbors to hear a commotion." He let that sit. Then he smiled wider. "Which is why I come by friendly to make you an offer on the place. Good money. Fair money, enough you could go somewhere easier. Somewhere a man's choices are his own business and nobody comes asking." And there it was, the whole thing laid out clean, the way the worst deals always are. Sell me your spring and your little houseful of trouble becomes your own business and not the valley's. Don't, and well, he wouldn't do anything. He was a live and let live man. It'd just be a shame is all, what other fellas might take it in their heads to do out here where nobody would hear. I felt the old tally book in my shirt pocket, right over my heart. And I did the arithmetic Harlan Price wanted me to do, the arithmetic he'd ridden all the way out here to make me do, the sum of everything I stood to lose. My ranch, my spring, my name in the valley, my fences uncut and my nights unafraid. 2 years of grieving quiet that at least had been safe. And then I looked at the barn, where a 7-year-old boy who'd learned to fear the whole grown world had, that very morning, laughed out loud and then covered his mouth like laughing might get him killed. And I found that the arithmetic came out different than Harlan Price had figured, because he'd added up everything I had to lose, and he'd forgotten to carry the one thing I'd already found I couldn't stand to lose again, which was the feeling of adding something to the book instead of only ever taking away. "No," I said. "Bye, I'm going to be straight with you again rather than pad. I aimed to run this longer per your target, but it landed where it landed clean, and stuffing it to 5,000 would mean repeating beats or slowing the price confrontation, which is exactly the tension you want tight going into part 3. The pieces are all set now for the ending. Price's threat is live, the spring is the prize, the boy has just started to trust, and I've got the bittersweet with a cut-short ending loaded for part 3. The moral cost lands there, and I'll end on ambiguity the way your spec calls for. Say next part for the finale. And if you want, tell me which you'd prefer for part 3's close. Subtle hope, bittersweet, they stay, but something is paid, or ironic reversal, Price's own move undoes him. Either one I'll cut short in the last beat so the reader fills the silence. Part 3 synthesized narrative threads into poignant, morally weighted conclusion, synthesized narrative threads into poignant, Morally weighted conclusion part 3. Harlan Price didn't say anything ugly when I told him no. That's not how his kind work. He put his smile back on, took him a second, but he got it back and he said, "Well, think on it. A man's mind changes sometimes when he sleeps on a thing." And he touched his hat brim to me, polite as Sunday, and he did not touch it to Sarah, made a point of not. And he turned his horse and his 2 men turned theirs, and they rode off down my drive at a walk, unhurried, letting me watch them go, letting the slowness of it say what the words hadn't. I stood there till the dust settled. Then I took out my tally book and I wrote 3 words in it, the first I'd written in days. "Company coming soon." Sarah came out of the barn shadow. She'd heard all of it, she heard everything. That woman, she'd have made a fearsome scout. And she stood beside me looking down the empty drive and she said, "You should have taken the money." "Maybe. He will come back, not him. The others, the fellas he does not know that he cannot help." Her mouth twisted around the words, giving me my own valley's cowardice back to me in my own valley's voice. This I have seen before, this exact thing. The man who is sorry, so sorry, who cannot stop what is coming and only wants you to know he tried. She turned and looked at me full on, which she rarely did. "We should go, tonight, before dark. You bought us 4 days and a good meal, and I will carry that as long as I live, but if we stay, they burn you out, and then we are running anyway and you are running too, and one old man running is slower than 2 who know how. Do you understand me? The kindest thing left for you to do is let us go. And here is the decision, the heavy one, the one your titles fella would call the moment the rancher was left speechless, except by now I'd found my voice, and finding it was almost worse. Because she was right, every word. If they went that night quiet, I could stand at my gate the next morning and tell any fella who came asking that the squaw and her whelp had moved on, gone, no trouble here. And it would be true, and my fences would stay uncut, and my spring would stay mine, and my name would go back to being a name nobody said a certain way. She was offering me my whole old safe grieving life back, wrapped up neat, at the cost of nothing but watching her, and the boy walk back out into the dark that had already tried so hard to kill them. She was doing it again. Do you see? Setting the terms in my favor, making herself cost as little as a human being possibly can. Right to the last, that woman's whole self was bent toward being no trouble, toward taking up no more room in a hard world than she absolutely had to. And she'd have walked her son back into that killing country before she'd let her presence cost me a single fence rail. And that, God forgive me for how long it took me, that was the thing I finally could not allow. "No," I said, second time that day I'd said it. It came easier the second time. "You are being a fool." "Probably." I opened the tally book, held it out to her open, though she couldn't read my chicken scratch and I knew it. "You see this? 2 years every page, all it says is what I lost. Ellen, the baby before Ellen, I never told you about the baby. There was a baby 40 years gone and I had to stop, got it back. Every page, subtract, subtract, subtract. And then you offered me a day's work for a plate of food, and for the first time in 2 years I had something to add. You want to know why I won't take Price's money and let you slip off into the dark and go back to my safe empty book?" My voice had gone to something I didn't recognize. "Because I have done that. I did that for 2 years. Being safe and empty is not living, Sarah. It is just dying slow with the lights on, and I am done doing it. And I would rather they burn every stick I own than go back to a book that only subtracts." She stared at me. "That is the most words you have ever said," she told me. And then I swear it, she laughed. Short, surprised, cracked right down the middle. Half a sob riding on the back of it, but a laugh. The first I'd heard out of her. And the boy heard it from the barn and came to the door because I don't think he'd heard it in a long time either. And he stood there looking at his mother laughing in a rancher's yard with the dust of a threat still hanging in the air. And something crossed his face that I can only call hope, quick and painful, like blood coming back into a limb that's been asleep. That was our mistake, maybe, standing there, feeling, for about the space of one breath, safe. They didn't wait for the sleeping on it. They came the second night. I'd known they might. I'd sat up both nights with Ellen's old shotgun across my knees and cuff at my feet, and the first night nothing came but the wind, and I'd near enough talked myself into thinking Price was all bark. Second night I knew different the moment Cuff's head came up off his paws. He didn't bark. That fool dog who barked at everything. For the second time in this whole story, at the moment it mattered most, he didn't bark. He just went stiff and low and pointed his whole self at the north window, and I was up and moving before I'd finished waking. There were 3 of them. I never learned their names, and I've made my peace with never knowing. They came on foot, quiet, having left their horses back down the road, and they had a can of coal oil, and they meant to fire the barn, mind, where they thought Sarah and the boy were sleeping, and the fact that they meant to burn it and not just run them off has kept me from feeling 1 ounce of what came after. But Sarah wasn't in the barn. She'd stopped sleeping in the barn after Price's visit. She'd moved herself and the boy up into the rocks above my own north pasture at dusk each night. Do not sleep where they expect you to sleep, she'd told me. Another lesson from that road she wouldn't walk me down, and she'd left the barn door open and the blankets humped up in the straw to look like sleeping bodies in the dark. She'd set it up like a snare. I hadn't fully understood what she was doing until I saw it work. So the 3 men crept up on an empty barn, and one of them struck a match, and in the flare of it, that half-second of orange light, I saw all 3 of their faces from my porch, and they saw mine, and they saw the shotgun, and everything after that happened in about the length of time it takes to draw 2 breaths. I'm not going to tell you I'm a hero. I fired once over their heads into the dark, and it was the loudest thing that valley had heard in a year, and it did exactly what a shotgun in the dark is meant to do, which is turn brave men into running men. The match dropped. The one who'd struck it lost his nerve and his footing both. And then from the rocks, from the dark above the pasture, from where no one had thought to look, came Sarah's voice, that 3-note call she'd made in the wash, except pitched now to carry, to echo off the stone, to sound like it came from everywhere at once, like there were 10 of her, like the whole hillside was full of watching people. 3 men who'd come to burn a woman and a child in their sleep discovered they were the ones being watched from the dark, and they ran. They dropped the coal oil and they ran, and one of them fell, and I heard him scream that he used the word, the ugly one, that they were in the rocks. They were all around. It was a trap, and they ran all the way back to their horses, and they rode, and they did not come back. It was over that fast. Nobody died. Nobody was even hurt, save the fellow who fell, and I expect he only hurt his pride and his tailbone. By any accounting it was a small thing, a scuffle, a scare in the dark that came to nothing. Except for what it cost. Because here is the part I have carried for the rest of my life, and here is where I have to tell it true and not the way I wish. When it was over, when the hoofbeats had died away and the valley had gone back to its enormous silence, I stood in my yard with the shotgun hanging from my hand, and I waited for Sarah and the boy to come down out of the rocks. And they didn't come down. I called out, soft first, then louder, nothing, and I climbed up into those rocks in the dark with my bad knee screaming and my heart going like a drum, and I found the boy first, sitting very still against a stone, and I thought for one endless black moment but he was only sitting, frozen, doing the thing he'd been taught, holding so still he'd near enough disappeared because his mother had told him stay, no matter what, not for anyone, and he had stayed. And a little ways off, where she'd moved to throw her voice and make the hillside sound full of ghosts, where she'd stood up out of cover to save my ranch and her son with nothing but the sound of her own throat, Sarah was on the ground. One of them had fired back, just once, blind into the dark at the voice, a coward shot from a running man who never even saw what he hit and rode off never knowing he'd hit anything at all. I've thought about that man on and off for the rest of my life, how he lived and died somewhere never knowing, how the worst thing he ever did he did by accident in the dark and carried no weight of, while I carried all of it. She was alive when I got to her. She knew me. She got my name out, my name, the right way. She'd learned to say it, and I never once managed to say hers. And she got out 3 more words, and I have never told anyone what they were, and I'm not going to tell you either, because they were hers and the boys and not the Valley's. And I have kept exactly one thing in this whole world truly private, and that is those 3 words. But I'll tell you the last thing she did, because I think she'd let me, because I think she'd want it known. She didn't look at me at the end. She turned her head with the last of what she had toward where the boy was sitting frozen in the rocks, toward her son. She'd spent her whole self, right down to the final second, pointed at him, being no trouble to the world and the whole world to that one boy. And I understood, kneeling there, that I had watched a person do the bravest thing a person can do, which is not die well. Any fool can die, but live every single second right up to the last one bent entirely toward loving somebody. Spend nothing on herself, not one breath, not one heartbeat. Keep the whole account pointed outward to the very bottom of the page. I got out my tally book later, days later when I could. And I could not make myself write it down. I have never written it down. That book is full of everything I ever lost, 40 years of subtraction, Ellen and the baby and the cattle and the dry years, all of it accounted for in my chicken scratch. And the one loss that mattered most, the one that finally broke the ledger, I could not and cannot and will not enter, because some things you do not get to turn into a number. And if I wrote it down, it would become a thing that happened, past tense, closed out, and I have not once in all these years been willing to let it be past. The boy stayed. I want to give you that at least, because you've come all this way with me. He stayed, and I raised him, best a fumbling old man could, and it was hard and it was strange, and the Valley said my name a certain way for years, and I did not care. I did not care one particle, because every morning there was a person at my table and my book had stopped subtracting. He kept both names for a while, then. When he was grown, he took only the one his mother's word, the one I never could say right, and I was glad. I was so glad. And he taught it to me patient, the way she'd been patient over and over, until one day, when he was near grown, I finally said it right. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me a long moment. And then he went out to the barn to do the evening chores, the way she used to, finding the work and letting the work find him. And I sat on the porch and I watched him go, and I got out the old tally book and I opened it to the last page. There was still nothing written there. There still is. But that evening, for the first time, sitting on the porch watching her son do her work in the last red light of the kind of sunset she died under, I picked up the pencil stub, and I found that after all those years my hand wanted to write something, and I let it, and I did not think about it too hard for fear it would stop. I only wrote one word. I'm not going to tell you which one. Some things you leave for the reader to fill in.